Hi, my name is Barisara. My student number is 61002321, and this presentation looks at a real business problem facing small Australian cafes. Should they raise their menu prices, and if so, by how much? I used the real government data and Excel tools to find out. So, since 2021, small cafes across Australia have been hit hard. The cost of good, wages, and energy has gone up a lot, squeezing their profit margin, and at the same time, customers are under financial pressure from high interest rates and slow economic growth. So, they're more careful about what they spend. So, the question is, should a cafe raise its price given the current conditions, and if so, by how much? To answer this, I use real data from three official Australia sources: CPI data from the ABS, the RBA cash rate, and GDP figures, all covering from 2020 to 2025. My first framework that I'm going to be talking about is inflation money. So in Australia, inflation is measured by CPI, and the RBA tries to keep it between 2 to 3% per year. For a cafe, inflation hits from two sides. Costs go up, ingredient, wages, energy, and then there's the question of whether you can actually pass those costs onto customers through higher menu prices. Looking at the data before 2022, food inflation was stable around 2%. Then in 2022, it spiked to 9.2%, the highest in over 30 years, driven by supply chains issues, the Ukraine war, and the labor shortage after COVID. By 2025, it's settled back to around 3.2%, but that's still above the RBA target's rate. So costs haven't fully eased. Meanwhile, the RBA cut interest rate to 0.10% during COVID to support the economy, then aggressively raised them to 2022 from 2022 onwards, peaking at 4.35%. Higher rates mean people are more likely to save and less likely to spend, which directly affects cafes' customers. The takeaway: cafes' costs have risen roughly 25 to 30% since 2020. Not raising prices at all means absorbing all of that, which simply isn't sustainable. My second framework I'm looking at is sizing up the economy using GDP. So GDP is the total value of everything produced in the economy. It tells us how healthy the economy is, and more importantly for our cafe, how much money customers actually have to spend. In 2020, GDP contracted by 2.5% because of COVID lockdowns. The worst result since the Great Depression. It bounced back in 2021, but by 2024, growth has slowed to just 1.1%, the weakest in decades outside of COVID. This is why inflation and GDP tells opposite stories. Inflation says costs are up, so raise prices, but GDP say customers are stretched, so be careful. That tension is exactly the business problem. The data supports a moderate rise of 3 to 4%, enough to recovering the rising cost, but not so much that it drives customers away. In my fifth slide, I'm using pivot table analysis as my first tool. And I brought all three data sources together: CPI, GDP, and the RBA cash rate, summarized by year. What it reviews was surprising because most people would assume that 2022 was the hardest year for cafes because food inflation peaked at 7.1%. But when you add GDP into the picture, 2023 was actually the most dangerous year. Yes, inflation has eased a little, but the RBA rate hikes has almost slammed the brakes on consumer spending. GDP fell to 2%, and customer had less to spend on things like cafes visits, so the cafe facing higher costs and falling revenue at the same time. By 2025, the picture finally starts to balance. Food CPI is down to 3.2%, GDP is recovering, and the rates are easing. This is the first real window to raise prices since the pandemic. My recommendation is a 3 to 4% selective increase on high cost items, aligned with the ABS meal out sub index of 3.5%, which shows that the industry is already moving in this direction. For my sixth slide, I'm using charts to demonstrate the CPI, mu out inflation, and the RBA cash rate quarterly from 2020 to 2025. The key things to notice is the timing gap. Inflation spiked sharply from early 2022, but the RBA didn't start raising rates until May 2022. And it took months for higher rates to actually slow spending. So by the time policy kicked in, cafe costs has already been rising over a year. That lag is exactly what inflation and money framework predicts. And by 2025, all three lines converge around 3 to 4%. Costs are easing but not gone. The bar charts compare the same indicators year by year. The key insight here is the combination. 2022 had high food costs, but GDP was still healthy at 3.9%, so customer could absorb price rises. But by 2024, food cost has eased, yet GDP was only at 1.1%, meaning customers were most stretched, and 2025 is the year of both sides of the equation are in a workable range, making it the right moment for a careful price increase. For my seventh slide, I'm using regression, and I tested whether the food CPI can predict GDP growth using Excel data analysis two pack across 24 quarters. The R square is 0.08%, meaning the food CPI only explained about 8% of GDP variation. The p value of 0.17 means the result isn't statistically significant at the standard threshold, but rather than treating this as a failure, it actually makes sense. Two data points: the COVID crash in 2020 and the rebound in 2021 were caused by lockdown, not food prices. They pull regression line out of shape. No single indicator can predict GDP on its own. And that's the point. It's why I use two frameworks together. What the regression does confirm that plugging in 2025 food CPI of 3.2% gives a predicted GDP about 1.6%, close to actual 1.9%. The economy is in a low but stable growth phase, which is exactly the right environment for a small targeted price rise. For my conclusion, the skills in this presentation would be valued in a business analyst role in the food and hospitality sector. Someone who can take ABS and RBA data and turn into a clear recommendation for a client. At the start of this unit, I can only do basic Excel, like simple sums and plain charts, but now I can build pivots table, run regression, use conditional formatting, use sum if and average ifs, and create charts. But most importantly, I can now connect economic theory to a real data. Inflation, GDP, monetary policy, these aren't just abstract concepts anymore. I can use them to answer a specific question, business question with evidence. The question I started with was simple. Should a small Australian cafe raise its price? The answer is yes, 3 to 4% selectively in 2025 because the data says now is the right time. Thank you.